Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about this concept of human population growth and specifically start to get an idea of how a growing human population could impact the planet. The first thing we need to start to think about is a little bit about the history of human population. You'll notice that all the way up until this point here, you can see that we had a very, very low population. I mean, less than 1 billion people. You see here we had 1 billion people, and that didn't happen until about 1800. For the last millions and millions of years, you basically have the fact that humans were limited in their population, and it wasn't until the last 150 or 200 years that human population really started to explode. And you can see here it's growing. We learned that this is called exponential growth, and that this is going up from 1 billion and it doubles in 130 years. It doubles again 45 years later, and this is in the year 2000. In fact, today, if we were to look at this, this is off the charts today, where up here last year in 2012, we hit a population of 7 billion humans on the planet. Now, the big question we have to ask ourselves is the planet able to sustain a human population of that size and growing constantly? There's a lot of indicators of why this is happening. Originally, again, back when we had this real flat trend, we had a lot of things, like humans couldn't deal very easily with a lot of sicknesses. The ability to have enough food to feed the population wasn't as common, and we just didn't have the technology to support the growing human population. Around the 1800s and throughout the 1800s, we started to gain better knowledge of disease, we started to get better medicine, and then cities themselves also were better fit to have nutrition. You know, foods were able to get shipped in, and sanitation, something as simple as putting in sinks to wash your hands and sewers to remove waste, was a huge factor in letting humans stay healthy longer, and the longer you're healthy, the bigger the population gets. Throughout this unit, we're going to talk really about two main types of countries. We're going to talk about more economically developed countries and less economically developed countries. It's real easy to at least start with examples of countries, because if you've traveled anywhere, you can start to get an idea of which types of countries we're looking at. For example, a lot of European countries, Germany, France, and then things like the United States, Canada, Australia. A lot of these countries are very economically developed. That means most of their infrastructures are in place. They have access to food, shelter, water, transportation, sanitation. And notice that 1/5 of the world's population are in economically developed countries, which means that 4/5 or 80% of the population lives in less economically developed countries. The economically developed countries are 1% of the world population growth, while the less economically developed countries are the main driving force behind our population up to 7 billion where it currently is. Less economically developed countries include places like Africa, India, China, Latin and South America, and Eastern European countries. They have a lot more problems with things like malnutrition, illiteracy, which is the inability to read well, disease, high infant mortality. That means if a child is born, there's a pretty good chance they're going to die within a short time of their birth. A lower life expectancy, which means that people die at a younger age. Not enough food, so there's a lot of, that goes back to malnutrition, and they have inaccess to clean water, and they often don't always have shelter. So what are some of the demands of a growing population? Well, a lot of times in order to have a growing population, we have the need to basically have more food, more pristine land, things that might have been forest, which is pretty important for the ecosystem, could be turned into farmland, which leads to things like deforestation, erosion of the soil that's there, and it also lowers the overall productivity because a lot of the nutrients are pulled out of the soil. In addition, you might have noticed this in a lot of cities that the majority of people no longer live in the country but actually go to cities because they're looking for jobs where a lot of jobs exist, or the chances that they maybe go to another country because there's just not enough opportunity in the country that they live in. one of the answers is then, if we go back to this idea here, right? If we come back to this and say, well, more economically developed countries are usually considered places that are a bit more wealthy. So is the answer to our problem, so we can get to a lower population growth, just to make everyone more wealthy? Well, more wealth does have some positives, like safe drinking water, sanitation, the ability to use fuel a little more efficiently, and the opportunity to have a better lifestyle choice. However, the ability to have a better lifestyle also has some negatives. So more affluent people, they tend to use more energy overall, which equals a lot of pollution through carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases and waste. There's not enough resources in the world to sustain everybody. So if you measured your footprint recently, your carbon footprint or your economic footprint, a lot of times it says, how many Earths do you live on? So do you live on one Earth, or does your lifestyle take 2 Earths, or does it take 3 Earths? There's some countries, for example, Americans, they could use 4 or 5 or more Earths just to meet their daily needs. And we'll get into this concept of carbon footprints, because you might say, well, it's impossible because we don't have 5 Earths, we only have 1 Earth to live on. And then affluent communities do not necessarily feel the impacts of their lifestyle. A lot of times what we're going to find out is that the things supporting an affluent lifestyle aren't going to produce, let's say, pollution and environmental stress in a local area, but they're often shipped out to other areas in terms of waste, in terms of energy use, in terms of where a lot of these resources come from. That's going to lead us into looking at specific countries. We're going to get more into this idea later of a population profile, but let's just take a quick look and talk about a population pyramid. This is a really easy way. You'll often see the name of a country written on the top here, and this is going to indicate to us, first of all, males versus females, and then where the population is. So you can see over here we've got age. Down here we have it could be the percent of the population or the physical numbers of population. So these are the youngest and these are the oldest members of the population. And you can kind of see that in this population, these adults here that are of reproductive age are having fewer and fewer kids. So this brings us to a few key terms. Two that we really need to understand well are fertility rate and replacement level fertility. Fertility rate is simply the number of children that a woman can have over her lifetime. And replacement fertility is the fertility rate that we need just to replace the population. So, for example, if we have 2 parents, and in order to replace themselves, they would need to have 2 offspring, which means the population hasn't grown, but they have 2 turns into 2 offspring. So back to these population pyramids and starting to make some bigger connections to developed versus developing countries. Now these we would often refer to, more developing countries are less economically developed countries, and developed countries are usually more economically developed countries. You can see here Kenya, which is a country in Africa, has this typical pyramid shape here. It's more of a triangular shape compared to the United States and Germany have less of a pyramid shape. They're almost flat on the edge. Germany is pretty unique because its population is actually shrinking. And you can see this because the adults, again, are having less of a population, less kids to replace them. So you can see this inward pointing growth, which means the population of that country is shrinking. Okay, so there's other strategies we can look at. We could talk about population control policies like family planning. Some countries like China have had their attempted one-child policy. If the child wasn't male, they'd sometimes allow for a second child. And this can work where we've got a government implemented policy, but we could also have education among people to help let them choose this on their own. We could also concentrate on the economic development of certain countries to help population control. So investing in countries, in those less economically developed countries, to help them achieve modernization so that they can slow down their population. Some of the factors that influence these growing sizes, these growing numbers, are things like if you get old, you would want your family to take care of you. So the more kids you have, the more people you have to take care of you. The idea that if you have a child that's probably going to die early, in some countries, if 2 out of 5 children die, that means that they would want, if they have 5 children, they're only expecting 3 to survive. So they have to, if they want a family of 3, they don't just have 3 children, they have 5 children. And with medicine getting better, this is becoming less and less, that 2 are going to die, but then that all 5 of these kids survive. In a lot of less economically developed countries, you'll see that there's not a real strong push for education. And if you don't have to educate your child at a young age, it means they can work at a younger age to make money for the family. A lot of times the status of women can influence this. Less educated women often have more children. So I've used a few pictures and graphs. I want to cite my sources. I hope you learned something new today. If you need time to go back and look at any of those slides, I'd strongly encourage it. But again, this is an introduction, so we're going to take more time to break down some of those topics and review them more later. Thanks for tuning in.